A homeless war hero on trial. What happens when the judge hears his name stuns everyone. The gavel cracked against the hardwood with a sharp finality. Defendant, stand. Every eye in the crowded municipal courtroom shifted to the figure in the worn, mud-stained jacket. He rose slowly, joints stiff, his broad shoulders slumped beneath a fraying army green coat that had once been crisp and uniform. His beard was unkempt, streaked with ash and time, and his boots split at the seams whispered of too many miles walked with nowhere to go. The charge was read aloud: trespassing, disorderly conduct, resisting removal from private property. The words clung to the air like accusations of something far worse than the truth. He had been found sleeping in the doorway of a closed grocery store, shivering through the winter night. The prosecutor's voice dripped with cold disdain, painting him not as a man down on his luck, but as a nuisance, a disruption to order. Yet, what silenced the courtroom was not his ragged appearance. It was the way he stood, unflinching, motionless, as if every insult and accusation slid off him like rain on stone. He spoke not a word, even as the whispers spread. Some called him a drunk. Others muttered the cruelest word of all: worthless. No one yet knew his name. And, when it was finally spoken, it would stop even the judge's breath. His name was Daniel Cross. Years before he stood in that courtroom, he had stood in desert heat so blistering, it peeled skin, beneath skies red with fire and gunpowder. He had led men through battles that most of the world never read about in newspapers, because the truest sacrifices were the ones no one saw. Daniel had been a captain in the Marines. His hands, now scarred and weathered, had once carried wounded comrades to safety under the deafening rattle of machine fire. His voice, now hoarse from nights of cold silence on city streets, had once barked orders that saved lives. The memory that haunted him most was not of the battlefield itself, but of a single night, the ambush in Kandahar. His convoy had been torn apart, his men scattered and bleeding. Daniel, refusing to abandon them, had dragged 3 soldiers from burning vehicles while flames singed his uniform. The heat of that fire still clung to him in dreams, but he could not save them all. One soldier, Private First Class Nathaniel Nate Rivers, had looked him in the eyes in those final seconds, lips cracked with dust and blood, whispering words Daniel would never forget. "Go home for me, sir. Live, for both of us." But when Daniel returned home, home had changed. The parades faded, friends drifted away. The government checks barely covered rent. Nightmares carved deep trenches in his sleep. And one winter, when the landlord knocked for the last time, Daniel stepped onto the street with nothing but a duffel bag and the weight of every life he couldn't save. Now, years later, he stood accused in a courtroom where no one cared for the story etched in his eyes. The prosecutor described him as dangerous, a repeat trespasser, a man who had rejected every offer of help. The audience nodded in quiet agreement, unwilling to look at him as anything more than the shadow society preferred not to see. Daniel's silence only angered them further. Why would he not defend himself? Why did he not beg for mercy? But silence was his armor. The judge, a stern woman with years of hardened rulings behind her, tapped her pen. "Mr. Cross," she said, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" He lifted his head. His eyes, pale and unyielding, carried the depth of deserts, the smoke of battles, and the grief of names carved into stone memorials. But he said nothing. The courtroom shifted uncomfortably. His silence felt less like weakness and more like defiance. What no one there knew was that Daniel Cross had once stood beside men who received the nation's highest honors. That his chest, now hidden beneath layers of thrift store cloth, had once carried medals for valor and sacrifice. That he had walked among rows of folded flags handed to mothers and fathers, whispering words of comfort even as his own heart broke. But the system had failed him. Paperwork lost, promises broken, appointments missed because of panic attacks that left him gasping on sidewalks. He slipped through cracks so wide they swallowed him whole. And still, he endured. On the night of his arrest, the police officer who found him had not asked his name. He had only barked, "Move along." When Daniel, groggy and frozen, did not rise fast enough, they had forced his arms behind his back. He had not resisted, not truly, but his silence had been mistaken for defiance. Now, here he was, a decorated war hero standing trial as if he were nothing more than a vagrant. The clerk cleared his throat, flipping through the case file. His voice carried across the courtroom. Name, Daniel Christopher Cross. The judge froze. The pen slipped from her hand. For the first time in years on the bench, her composure cracked. The prosecutor looked up, puzzled. The spectators shifted uneasily. The judge's eyes widened. She leaned forward, studying the man before her. She whispered, almost to herself, "It can't be." Because the judge, Honorable Margaret Rivers, was the mother of Nathaniel Rivers, the soldier Daniel had carried from the flames in Kandahar. Her son had never come home, but he had died with Daniel Cross at his side. The room seemed to collapse into stillness. Judge Rivers searched the defendant's face, piecing together the years, the scars, the hardened lines. And then she saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "You were there," she said softly, breaking judicial distance. "The night my son—" Her voice faltered, and the courtroom gasped. The prosecutor objected, stumbling over his own words. "Your Honor, with respect, this is irrelevant to the case." But the judge silenced him with a raised hand. Her authority was iron, but her voice trembled. "Irrelevant? This man carried my son from the battlefield. He was the last to see him alive. Do you dare call that irrelevant?" Daniel still did not speak. His silence was no longer seen as stubbornness, but as sacred. It was the silence of a man who had borne too much, who had no words left to defend himself, because his life itself was the defense. And in that silence, the balance of power shifted. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Spectators who had sneered now looked ashamed. A bailiff, once stern, lowered his eyes with sudden respect. The prosecutor fumbled his papers, suddenly aware he had been condemning not a vagrant, but a hero. The judge rose from her seat. "Mr. Cross," she said, voice firm yet breaking with emotion, "you once carried my son. Today, allow me to carry you." The word struck the room like thunder. Daniel's silence cracked at last. His lips parted, voice gravelly but clear. "Your Honor, I swore I'd bring him home. I couldn't keep that promise. I failed him, and I failed you." Judge Rivers shook her head fiercely, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You did not fail. You gave him dignity. You gave him a chance to be remembered not as a casualty, but as a soldier who fought to the end. That is not failure, Captain Cross. That is honor." The courtroom, once buzzing with judgment, now sat in reverent silence. The prosecutor dropped the case without further protest, his words stumbling as he acknowledged extraordinary circumstances. But the judge went further. She ordered immediate dismissal of all charges. She called upon the court clerk to contact Veteran Services that very hour, ensuring Daniel Cross would not walk back into the cold streets, but into a program that would provide shelter, counseling, and dignity. And then, in an act that stunned everyone, Judge Rivers stepped down from the bench. She crossed the courtroom floor, not as a judge, but as a grieving mother. She stood before Daniel Cross and placed a trembling hand over his heart. "For every night you slept on the street, this nation failed you," she whispered. "But you will not be forgotten anymore. Not while I breathe." 3. The crowd, moved beyond words, rose to their feet, not in applause, but in solemn respect like soldiers saluting a fallen comrade. The silence was louder than any cheer. As Daniel left the courthouse that day, escorted not by police but by veterans who had come upon hearing his name, he spoke a sentence that would live far beyond those walls. "A uniform may fade, but the oath never does." And later, When reporters pressed Judge Rivers for comment, she offered a line that struck the nation's heart. Sometimes, the greatest battles our heroes fight are the ones we never see, and shame on us when we let them fight alone. Weeks later, Daniel stood not in rags but in clean clothes, hair trimmed, his back straighter. He had been given a bed, a place to belong, and a chance to heal. Judge Rivers visited him often, bringing photographs of her son, sitting for hours as Daniel shared stories of the battlefield memories that allowed a grieving mother to know the man her boy had become. For Daniel, it was the beginning of something he thought he had lost forever: home. And though the nightmares still came, though the scars remained, he no longer bore them in silence. His story had become a light for others, proof that even the most forgotten among us may carry histories that could humble kings. Respect is not given to uniforms alone. It belongs to the men and women who wore them, who sacrificed pieces of themselves that can never be repaid. Daniel Cross stood trial as a homeless man, but left as what he had always been: a hero. It reminds us of a truth we must never forget. The person we pass on the street may carry a story that could stop the world. Wherever you're watching this from, share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what this story means to you. And if you believe the unseen heroes of this world deserve to be remembered, subscribe for more stories that honor their silent strength. Because sometimes, the quietest people carry the loudest legacies.